A contract by fate. The sprawling metropolis below glistened like a tapestry of hope and ambition as Isel Chosen gazed out of his penthouse office. His fingers lightly brushed against the edge of the desk. Polished mahogany, a symbol of his past victories, his long climb to the top. But today that desk seemed cold, impersonal, like a marker of the emptiness that filled him. At 35, Isel had everything a man could dream of: wealth, power, and an empire that spanned continents. Yet, standing on the precipice of his crumbling marriage, he felt smaller than ever before. A gust of wind carried the scent of rain through the open windows, the golden rays of the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. The divorce papers on his desk, once signed with the hope of preserving a future, now served as a harsh reminder of betrayal. His eyes lingered over the signature of Adrienne, his soon-to-be ex-wife. The elegant curves of her name, once a mark of love, now seemed like a distant memory, a false promise. The life he'd imagined with her had unraveled in a matter of days. His mind raced back to the moment he discovered the truth, the moment everything changed. Adrienne, the woman he trusted with his heart and business, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. She hadn't just been unfaithful in their marriage. No, it was worse. She'd aligned herself with Hartford Global, trying to steal the very soul of Chosen Industries. A well-executed plan, carefully crafted with the guise of love, had been the key to her betrayal. As Isel swirled the amber liquid in his glass, he found himself trapped in a storm of emotions. His reflection in the mirror told the story of a man who was trying desperately to hold it all together. But beneath the facade, the cracks were beginning to show. Dark circles under his eyes, unkempt hair. He looked like the man he never thought he'd become. The ice king of the corporate world, who once commanded attention with his cold professionalism, was now on the verge of breaking. "Mr. Chosen," the voice of his assistant, Sarah, interrupted his thoughts. "The board is waiting for you in the conference room." With a heavy sigh, he composed himself. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." His voice, although strained, still carried the authority of a leader. Despite the wreckage of his personal life, he could not afford to show weakness. Not now. Not when his company was at risk. The journey to the conference room felt like a lifetime. His mind was already shifting gears, formulating strategies to stabilize Chosen Industries. The divorce was just the beginning. There were bigger problems at play, problems that could jeopardize everything he had worked for. He reached the doors of the conference room, and as they swung open, his mind sharpened. He was Ice King once again, a ruler in a world of cold, hard business. Inside, the board members greeted him with tense silence. They were all aware of his personal turmoil, but in their eyes, it was his leadership that mattered. The question of succession loomed large. Without an heir, the bylaws of Chosen Industries would be challenged. His position, his legacy, could slip from his grasp. "Mr. Chosen, the board is concerned about the future of the company." Marcus Chen, his head of legal, began, his tone careful. "We need to address the succession issue. The shareholders require reassurance. How does one secure the future of this company when betrayal is lurking in every corner?" Isel's voice was low, the bitterness seeping through despite his attempts to remain composed. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "There are options. Contract marriages are not uncommon in these circles. They can provide the stability you need." A contract marriage. The idea should have repulsed him. But in that moment, it made perfect sense. It was cold, pragmatic, just like the world he now inhabited. No emotions, no betrayals, just a business transaction that would secure his position and the future of his company. "Draw up a preliminary contract," Isel said, his voice steady, but with a certain resolve. "Make it ironclad. Infidelity, corporate espionage, social media behavior, leave nothing to chance." Marcus nodded. "Any specific requirements for potential candidates?" Isel turned back to the window, watching the city he had built, its towering skyscrapers reflecting the last light of the day. someone with a professional background, preferably in finance or law. No existing connections to any competing corporations, and absolutely no one from Adrian's social circles. With those words, the future began to take shape. A calculated decision. A cold solution to a broken heart. He would not allow love to interfere again. His next marriage would be a contract, nothing more. Meanwhile, across the city, Kaylee Iden, a young financial analyst, was wrapping up another late night at work. Her office was silent, the hum of her computer, the only sound that accompanied her thoughts. At 28, she had already proven herself as one of the brightest minds in her firm, Sterling and Associates. But despite her success, the weight of her responsibilities felt like a constant burden. Her mother's medical bills were mounting, and every dollar she earned seemed to slip away just as quickly. Kaylee had learned early on that the world didn't care about your dreams, only about what you could offer. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificing her social life and personal happiness for the sake of her career and her family. But deep down, she knew that the life she had imagined for herself seemed increasingly distant. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something in her gut told her this wasn't just another telemarketer. Miss Iden. The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative. This is Marcus Chen from Chosen Industries. I apologize for the late hour, but we have a matter to discuss. I believe it could be a life-changing opportunity for you. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m.? Kaylee's heart raced as she processed his words. Life-changing. What could someone from Chosen Industries possibly want with her? Her mind whirred as she considered the possibilities, but she couldn't ignore the thought of her mother's hospital bills looming over her like a storm cloud. I'll need to check with my supervisor, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. It's been arranged. A car will pick you up at 8:30 a.m., Marcus replied smoothly, before ending the call. Kaylee sat back, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. What was this about? Why her? She had no idea, but something told her that this was no ordinary offer. This could change everything. The next morning, as she rode in the back of a sleek black Mercedes, the city outside transformed before her eyes. The towering skyscrapers of the financial district reflected the morning sun, casting long shadows on the streets below. Kaylee had never seen the city from this perspective, so vast, so powerful. And ahead, in the distance, loomed the Chosen Industries building, its 100 stories of glass and steel gleaming like a fortress in the sky. As the car pulled up to the entrance, Kaylee felt a surge of uncertainty. What was she walking into? But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something much larger than she had ever anticipated. And so, the story of Isel Chosen and Kaylee Iden began. A journey that would test their hearts, challenge their convictions, and ultimately reveal that sometimes the most unexpected of circumstances can lead to the deepest of love. A contract of convenience. The sleek black Mercedes rolled smoothly through the glass doors of the Chosen Industries building, its tires almost silent as it navigated the grand lobby. Kaylee Iden's heart beat faster with each passing second, her pulse quickening in anticipation. This wasn't just another corporate meeting. This was the kind of opportunity that could change the trajectory of her entire life. But how? What could she possibly offer a company like Chosen Industries, let alone its powerful CEO? As she stepped out of the car, the chill of the morning air caught her by surprise. She adjusted the lapels of her modest blazer and walked into the towering lobby, her sensible shoes clicking on the marble floor, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the space around her. The grand chandelier overhead shimmered in the sunlight, casting a warm glow on the polished granite walls. The lobby was empty at this hour, but it felt like the pulse of the city had taken root in this magnificent building. A receptionist greeted her with a professional smile, her eyes briefly flickering over the young woman before she spoke. Miss Iden, welcome. Mr. Chen is expecting you. Please follow me. The walk to the elevator was brief, but it felt like an eternity. The walls were adorned with fine art, all reflecting power and prestige. The silence was broken only by the soft hum of the elevator as it ascended. Kaylee's thoughts swirled. Was this all real? Or was she about to step into some elaborate corporate trap? When the doors opened, she was ushered down a long corridor lined with glass offices. At the end of the hall stood a set of imposing double doors, guarded by 2 assistants. Kaylee's breath caught as she was escorted inside. Inside the office, the sight before her was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Isel Chosen, the enigmatic CEO she had only ever read about, sat behind a grand mahogany desk, his posture straight, his expression focused yet unreadable. The room itself was a testament to wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city below, the entire space flooded with natural light. The walls were decorated with minimalist art, while the furniture was modern and luxurious. It was clear that this was a man who spared no expense. "Miss Iden," Isel said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. He stood as she entered, extending a hand with deliberate, measured precision. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Kaylee hesitated for just a second before taking the seat opposite him. She couldn't help but study him as she sat. Tall, commanding, his features sharp yet handsome, with an air of indifference that only added to his mystique. His steel-gray eyes held a certain coldness that seemed to reflect the power he wielded, the weight of an empire on his shoulders. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked for this meeting," Isel began, his voice steady, betraying none of the emotions that must have been swirling within him. "I'll get straight to the point. Chosen Industries is at a crossroads. My personal life has taken a difficult turn, and my company's future is at stake. There are certain traditions, rules, and bylaws in place that I must adhere to in order to maintain control. The board is concerned, and there is a specific matter that requires attention." Kaylee nodded, still processing the weight of the situation. She had been in the business world long enough to know that nothing came without a price, and something told her that whatever this was, it was going to demand everything she had. Isel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk. "Chosen Industries requires stability. The bylaws stipulate that the CEO must be married with an heir to maintain his position. In light of my impending divorce, that leaves me with a rather urgent need for a temporary solution, a contract marriage." The words hung in the air, and Kaylee's mind struggled to catch up. A contract marriage. This wasn't just business, it was personal, and deeply so. But the logic behind it was undeniable. A marriage on paper, no emotions, no attachments, just a binding agreement to secure the company's future. It made perfect sense, from a business perspective. But from a human perspective, the thought of such an arrangement left a knot in her stomach. "I understand if this sounds unorthodox, Miss Iden," Isel continued, sensing her hesitation. "But I need someone who is professional, intelligent, and who understands the gravity of the situation. Someone who can be a partner in this arrangement, nothing more. This is not a marriage in the traditional sense. There will be no romantic expectations, no emotional ties. Just a formal partnership that ensures stability for both the company and my position as CEO." Kaylee's mind raced. She had heard rumors about the personal lives of powerful CEOs, about marriages of convenience and the cold calculations that governed them. But she had never imagined being a part of one. The offer was outrageous, yet strangely tempting. "What would be expected of me?" she asked, her voice calm despite the storm of questions brewing inside her. Isel's eyes studied her, assessing her as though he were weighing her very soul. "You would maintain a public appearance as my wife, attend corporate events and functions, and help foster the image of stability that the shareholders require. In return, you would be compensated generously, with a clear and ironclad contract to protect your interests. Your personal life would remain entirely separate from mine. This is not a romantic endeavor, it's strictly professional." The terms were clear, almost too clear. No emotions, no connections, just business. But there was something about Isel Chosen that made Kaylee hesitate. His eyes were cold, but there was something more beneath that coldness, a depth that hinted at vulnerability, a crack in the armor that he wore so meticulously. Could it be that there was more to this man than the detached CEO persona he projected? The silence in the room stretched as Kaylee considered the offer. What could she say? This was a chance to change her life, to solve the financial burden that had been suffocating her family. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and she had no other options. But could she live with the consequences of entering into a marriage with a man she barely knew? Isel broke the silence. I know this is a lot to take in. Take your time to think it over. But know this, Miss Iden. This arrangement is time-sensitive. The longer we wait, the more instability there will be within the company. And that will harm both of us. Kaylee's thoughts were still racing as she processed everything. She had grown up in a world where practicality often trumped emotion. She had sacrificed so much to get where she was. This was a chance to secure her future and the future of her family. But at what cost? After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty. I'll consider it, but I need time to think through all the implications. Isel nodded, his face impassive. Of course. Take all the time you need. But remember, this is a decision that could change everything. As she stood to leave, Kaylee's heart was heavy with the weight of the decision before her. Could she really go through with this? Could she marry a man she hardly knew, bound only by a contract, in exchange for the life she had dreamed of? As the door closed behind her, Kaylee knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would test her in ways she could never have imagined. And as for Isel, he watched her leave with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had never believed in love or the fairy tales that so many others clung to. But for the first time in years, he found himself wondering, could this contract marriage be the start of something more? Something real. Something that could heal both of them in ways they never expected. Only time would tell. A marriage of convenience. The city streets below buzzed with life, but inside the sleek, modern office of Chosen Industries, there was an eerie stillness. The negotiation had been made, and now, Isel found himself staring at the blank, sterile page of the contract before him. The words were familiar. Terms of the arrangement, clauses about privacy, and strict stipulations regarding public appearances. A marriage, on paper, that would keep his company's legacy intact. It should have felt like a victory. After all, this was the solution to all of his problems. Yet, as his pen hovered over the final lines, he couldn't help but wonder if he was signing away more than just his future. Isel's mind had been restless ever since Kaylee Iden walked out of his office the previous day. He hadn't expected her to say yes so quickly. If anything, he had expected her to be skeptical, to balk at the cold, calculated nature of the arrangement. But there had been something in her eyes, a hesitation, a silent curiosity, that made him wonder, was it the desperation in her voice or the vulnerability that lingered in her words? He had learned not to trust emotions, especially in business. Yet something about Kaylee felt different. He leaned back in his leather chair, letting out a slow breath. The financial world had always been about numbers, profits, and control. Love, trust, and connections were luxuries he had long abandoned. His marriage to Adrienne had proven that. But now, here he was, at the precipice of another arrangement. A cold, contractual marriage that, in theory, should have been the perfect solution. He would never allow himself to make the same mistakes again. This would be different. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice steady. The door opened, and Marcus Chen stepped inside, carrying a folder filled with papers. His expression was as professional as always, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. He knew that Isel had a lot riding on this next step, and the board was watching every move. "The final draft of the contract," Marcus said, placing the folder on the desk. "Everything is in order. The terms are clear. We've also included some additional clauses to ensure that both parties are protected legally, should anything go awry." Isel nodded, his gaze fixed on the contract. He reached for the pen and signed his name, the bold strokes of his signature marking the finality of the decision. This wasn't a choice he'd made lightly, but there was no room for doubt now. He had a company to protect and a future to secure. Across the city, Kaylee was sitting at her small apartment's kitchen table, staring down at the contract in her hands. The words blurred before her eyes as she read through the dense legal jargon. The deal was simple enough. She would marry Isel Chosen, appear as his wife in public, and act as his partner in maintaining the company's reputation. In return, she would receive a substantial sum of money, along with a clause that guaranteed her protection and independence. She would be paid handsomely, her financial troubles solved, and her mother's medical bills covered for the foreseeable future. It seemed like the perfect solution. But could she live with the reality of it? Kaylee had grown up believing that the world was cold and indifferent to personal desires. Her mother's struggle with illness had left Kaylee with a sense of responsibility that far outweighed her own dreams. For years, she had sacrificed everything for the sake of survival, working long hours, watching as the world moved forward, while she remained stuck in a cycle of debt and duty. Now, she had a chance to break free, to secure her future and her family's future, to finally live a life without the constant weight of financial worry. But at what cost? She thought of Isel, his commanding presence, his cold demeanor, and the way he spoke with such certainty about the arrangement. A contract marriage, devoid of love, devoid of passion. A calculated solution to a personal and professional problem. But could she truly accept such an arrangement? Could she give herself to a man she barely knew, only to serve as a placeholder in his life, a cog in his grand machine? The phone buzzed on the table, breaking her from her reverie. She glanced down to see a message from her mother's caregiver. "Kaylee, your mom's treatment needs to be scheduled. The next payment is due soon." Her stomach tightened. No matter how much she wanted to find a different path, the reality was undeniable. Her mother's illness was the thing that anchored her to this decision. It wasn't just about money. It was about survival. With a resigned sigh, Kaylee placed the phone back on the table and looked down at the contract once more. She didn't have the luxury of time. There was no other option. She couldn't afford to back out now. She signed her name, the ink binding her to this decision. This marriage of convenience. The following week was a whirlwind. Kaylee moved into one of the Chosen family's properties, a modern penthouse apartment, far more luxurious than anything she had ever imagined. The space was cold and impersonal, with sleek, minimalist decor that seemed designed to reflect the impassive nature of its owner. It was a world apart from the modest apartment she had shared with her mother. Every corner of the new space seemed to echo with the silence of unfamiliarity, as if it had never been meant for someone like her. And yet, despite the overwhelming luxury, it was hard to ignore the nagging sense of emptiness. It wasn't just the apartment that felt alien. It was the entire situation. Every move she made, every gesture felt like part of an act, a performance she was playing for an audience that existed only in the shadows. The press, the board, the shareholders, they were all watching, expecting her to be the perfect wife, to the perfect CEO. Her first public appearance as Mrs. Chosen was a corporate gala, a dazzling affair that brought together the who's who of the business world. Kaylee wore an elegant gown that Isel had insisted she wear, her hair styled in an intricate updo, her makeup flawless. She was the epitome of the perfect wife, the poised, sophisticated partner to the formidable CEO. Isel, of course, was the star of the evening. His presence commanded attention, his charm a well-practiced act, his smile calculated to ensure that no one doubted his success. As the evening wore on, Kaylee found herself standing by Isel's side, the two of them exchanging polite smiles and making small talk with the guests. But beneath the surface, everything felt wrong. There was no warmth in their interactions, no spark, no connection. It was all part of the act. She was just a woman in a beautiful dress, standing next to a man in a tailored suit. There were no shared glances, no whispered words, just the cold, calculating nature of their arrangement. By the time the gala ended, Kaylee was exhausted. She had smiled, nodded, and performed her role to perfection. But as she and Isel left the event, she couldn't shake the feeling of disconnection. She wasn't really part of this world. She was an outsider, playing a part she didn't fully understand. Back at the penthouse, Isel spoke little, his mind already focused on the next steps for his company. Kaylee couldn't blame him. His world had always been one of business, one where emotions didn't have a place. But she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if there were no contracts, no formalities, if they could just be themselves, not bound by a paper that forced them into a life they didn't choose. And yet there it was, the silence that stretched between them, the emptiness that seemed to fill every room, every conversation. She had signed the contract, yes, but was this the life she wanted? As she stood in front of the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, she realized something profound. She wasn't just playing a role in his life, she was playing a role in her own. The question now was, how long could she keep up the act before the facade began to crack? For Isel, the facade was his fortress, his shield against the world. But for Kaylee, it was becoming a prison. Would they ever find a way to break free from the walls they had built around themselves? Or would they remain two strangers in a contract, bound by circumstance and duty, but never truly knowing each other? As the night grew quiet, one thing was certain. The future was uncertain, and the only thing that remained was the possibility of what might come next. The tipping point. The days following the gala blended into one another. Kaylee found herself slowly adjusting to her new life. The luxury of the penthouse, the impeccably tailored suits, the lavish parties, it was all part of the facade that she had to play a part in. But even though the material world around her was everything she had dreamed of, something deep inside her heart felt like it was suffocating. She'd signed the contract with the intent to secure her family's future. She told herself that every public event, every smile she had to wear, was a small price to pay for her mother's medical treatments and the stability that had always seemed just out of reach. The contract marriage with Isel chosen, as cold and calculated as it was, promised her security. And yet, the more time she spent in his presence, the more she found herself questioning if the price was worth it. There were moments when she caught glimpses of something else beneath Isel's unyielding exterior. He would let down his guard for a fraction of a second, perhaps when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and she would see the vulnerability in his eyes. But those moments were fleeting, like the last rays of sunlight before dusk, and just as quickly as they appeared, they would vanish. One evening, as Kaylee walked into the office after a long day of meetings, she found Isel standing by the large windows that overlooked the city. The view was breathtaking, the city lights shimmering like diamonds scattered across a velvet blanket. But it wasn't the view that held Kaylee's attention. It was him. He stood with his back to her, his arms crossed in front of him, his shoulders tense as he gazed out at the sprawling city below. He looked like a man who was carrying the weight of the world, someone who was used to making decisions that affected countless lives, but who had no one to lean on when the world became too heavy. Isel. Kaylee's voice broke through the silence, tentative but soft. She was beginning to realize that their lives, his and hers, were both so carefully constructed, like fragile pieces of glass that could shatter at any moment. Isel turned, his usual cool composure returning to his face. "Kaylee, I didn't hear you come in." There was something in his voice, though, that made her pause. He wasn't speaking to her as the CEO of Chosen Industries. There was no cold detachment in his tone, no formality. It was just a man, standing in front of her, alone. "I just came to say good night," she said, her voice betraying a quiet uncertainty. The words felt strange on her tongue, like a small, delicate bridge they had yet to cross. He nodded, his eyes briefly flickering with something unreadable. "Good night." But before she could turn to leave, he spoke again. "Kaylee, About the contract. I know this arrangement is unconventional. You must think I'm cold, a man who doesn't care about anything beyond the numbers, the business. But that's not true. I've made mistakes, and now I find myself in a position where I can't fix them. I don't expect you to understand, or to forgive me, but I want you to know that this wasn't how I envisioned my life. Kaylee stood frozen, her heart beating louder than ever. She had heard bits and pieces of Isel's backstory, how he had risen from humble beginnings, how his father had built chosen industries from the ground up, instilling in him a sense of duty and responsibility that had overshadowed everything else. But this was different. For the first time, she saw the man beneath the surface, the man who had buried his own emotions to protect his empire. The CEO was still there, but now she saw the cracks in his armor. "I don't think you're cold," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words surprised her even as they left her lips. "I think you're afraid. Afraid of losing everything you've worked for. But I think you've lost yourself along the way." Isel's expression faltered for a moment, as if her words had struck a chord deep within him. But he quickly masked it again, replacing it with that familiar, guarded expression. "I've never had the luxury of losing myself," he replied softly, almost as though he was speaking to himself more than to her. The silence between them felt heavy, pregnant with unsaid words. Kaylee took a step closer, unable to ignore the pull she felt toward him, the need to reach out, to bridge the chasm of distance between them. It wasn't just the loneliness that plagued him. It was the grief of losing something important, the belief that he had somehow failed, that the empire he had built was now teetering on the edge because of a single misstep. And here she was, standing in front of him. Someone who understood loss, who understood what it felt like to sacrifice everything for someone else's well-being. She had done that for her mother. He had done that for chosen industries. And somehow, they had ended up in the same place, lost in a sea of duty, forced to perform roles they never wanted. But it wasn't too late, was it? Couldn't they change things? Wasn't there more to life than this empty partnership, this contract that had brought them together but had never really connected them? "You don't have to keep pretending, you know," she said quietly, her voice soft but insistent. "Not with me. You've already lost so much, Isel. Why continue to bury the rest of it?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on her, as if he were trying to process the weight of her words. The CEO facade that he had worn so perfectly was starting to crack, piece by piece. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he had to hold the world together all on his own. The tension in his shoulders seemed to dissipate as he met her gaze with a surprising gentleness. "I don't know how to let go," he admitted, his voice quieter than it had been in their previous encounters. "I've been holding everything together for so long, I'm not sure I know who I am without it." Kaylee reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm, offering a comfort she wasn't sure he was ready to accept. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." His eyes softened, the first sign of warmth she had seen from him in weeks. "I don't know if I can trust anyone again." "Maybe you don't have to trust anyone right away," she said, her voice steady, but her heart racing. "Maybe we can take it one step at a time. Together." The words hung in the air, the weight of them both offering a quiet challenge and an invitation. Could they rebuild what had been broken? Could a contract marriage, born from necessity and cold logic, turn into something more, something real? As the night stretched on, neither of them moved. The city lights outside seemed to fade into the distance as Isel and Kaylee stood there, at the edge of a precipice, uncertain of what was to come. But in that moment, for the first time, they felt the possibility of change. The possibility of letting go, of trusting, even if just a little. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't love at first sight. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. Something that, against all odds, could grow. Shifting grounds. The following days passed in a haze of muted conversations and quiet moments. There were no grand declarations or sudden changes. No sweeping gestures to signify a dramatic shift in their relationship. But beneath the surface, something was subtly shifting. Isel found himself looking at Kaylee differently, not as a mere contractual partner, but as a person, a woman who had entered his life under the strangest of circumstances, yet had quickly become someone he couldn't ignore. Her presence was no longer just a formality. It was real. And that was the scariest part. Kaylee, too, felt the weight of change, though hers was less subtle. She had entered this arrangement with clear boundaries, with a well-defined purpose, to fulfill her role as Isel's wife in the public eye, to safeguard her family's future. But as the days wore on, as they spent more time together in the city's grandest events, in the quiet corners of the penthouse, she couldn't help but question whether she was still the person she had been before. Was this really what she wanted? To play the part of the perfect wife without ever truly knowing the man she had married. Each time she caught Isel in a moment of vulnerability, a fleeting expression that slipped through his stoic demeanor, her heart would tighten. He had been through so much. Betrayed by the woman he had loved, the world around him constantly threatening to tear apart everything he had built. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the walls he had constructed to protect himself from ever feeling that pain again. And yet those same walls were what kept her at arm's length. She could feel the subtle tension between them when they shared a quiet dinner, when they stood side by side at corporate functions, and when they parted for the night in the vast, empty silence of the penthouse. Their marriage was still an arrangement, still a contract that neither of them had truly agreed to beyond its terms. But something was different. She could sense it, feel it in the air between them. Something was slowly evolving, a change that neither of them could have predicted when they first entered this partnership. It was more than just the awkwardness of being strangers living in the same space. It was the fragile seed of connection that had taken root, barely visible but undeniable. One night, after a particularly draining business dinner, where Kaylee had been forced to smile and laugh at the right moments, she came back to the penthouse and felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The walls seemed to close in, the opulent surroundings a constant reminder of the life she had agreed to, but not the life she had chosen. She went straight to the balcony, hoping for some relief. The cool night air hit her like a wave, and she closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the city settle into her bones. The sound of distant traffic, the occasional honk of a horn, the hum of the nightlife. It all blended into the background as she took a deep breath, hoping that the simple act of breathing would provide clarity. Isel found her there, as he often did these days. He didn't need to say anything to announce his presence. There was something unspoken between them, a silent understanding that, in the stillness, they could both be themselves, even if just for a moment. "You look like you've been through a storm," he said quietly, standing beside her, but not too close. His voice was softer than usual, almost tentative. Kaylee opened her eyes, finding the distant skyline in front of her. "I'm not sure who I am anymore, Isel. I'm not sure what any of this is." His gaze followed hers, resting on the city below. There was a heaviness in his voice when he spoke again. "I don't think either of us really knew what this would be. A contract marriage. A solution to problems we never wanted in the first place. But here we are, and I wonder sometimes if we've made a mistake." It was the most vulnerable he had been since they first met. He wasn't looking at her for answers, but for some sort of shared recognition, something that could tie their separate worlds together, even if only for a brief moment. Kaylee turned toward him, her breath catching. She wasn't expecting him to open up like this. In all their time together, she had never seen him as uncertain as he was now. He was a man who controlled everything in his world, a man who had always been the pillar of strength, even when it cost him his own happiness. And yet here he was, admitting doubt, sharing something real. "I never thought a marriage could feel like a business transaction and an emotional labyrinth all at once," she said softly, her voice betraying the frustration she had been hiding. "But this doesn't feel like we're living. It feels like we're waiting for something to happen, waiting for a solution. But there's no clarity. no direction. Isil's eyes softened as he looked at her, the city lights reflecting in his gaze. Maybe there doesn't have to be clarity. Maybe we can take it one day at a time, one step at a time. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and tentative. It was a concept neither of them had considered before. After all, they had both entered this arrangement with specific outcomes in mind. Security for her, stability for him. But what if they allowed themselves to simply exist in the same space, without the pressure of expectations? What if they could stop pretending to be the people they had to be for the world, and instead be themselves? I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, Kaylee admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I do know that I can't keep pretending. I want to know you, Isil. I want to understand who you are, not just the CEO. I want to know the man behind all of this. Her words hung in the stillness of the night, raw and exposed. There was no pretense, no formality. It was as if she had broken through the walls they had both built and was speaking directly to him, to the part of him that had been hidden for so long. For a moment, Isil didn't say anything. His gaze remained fixed on her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. She had been a mere figure in his life, an obligation at first, then a partner in a contract. But now, in the stillness of the moment, he realized that there was so much more to her. So much more that he hadn't allowed himself to see. I've built this empire to protect myself from the world, he said, his voice low, almost regretful. But the more I build, the more I realize that I'm only protecting myself from feeling anything. And I don't know how to change that. Kaylee took a small step toward him, her hand almost instinctively reaching out, but she stopped herself just short. She could feel the weight of his confession, could sense how hard it was for him to allow himself to be vulnerable. But he had done it. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, something in the air between them seemed to shift again. It was no longer just about the contract, no longer just about fulfilling a role or playing a part. There was something else emerging, something raw and real that neither of them could ignore. You don't have to be perfect, Isil, she said softly. You don't have to protect yourself from me. I'm here, not because of a contract, but because I'm starting to believe that this, whatever this is, can be something more. Isil turned to face her fully now, his gaze steady but uncertain. For the first time, he wasn't the calculating CEO, the man who had everything under control. He was just a man, standing before her, unsure of where this new path would lead. Maybe we can try to figure it out together, he said, his voice tinged with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. No more contracts. Just us. One step at a time. And in that moment, with the city lights twinkling like distant stars around them, Kaylee and Isil found themselves at the beginning of something they hadn't expected, something that didn't need to be defined by rules or expectations, something that could grow if only they allowed themselves to step into the unknown together. It was no longer just about the marriage. It was about finding the courage to live it, day by day, together. And for the first time, they both believed it might be possible. Uncharted territory. The days that followed their quiet conversation on the balcony felt like the beginning of something new, though neither Kaylee nor Isil dared to put it into words. They had stepped into unfamiliar territory, and with each passing moment, they discovered that the contract they had signed together was not the end of their journey. It was merely the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Isil had always been a man of control, of precision. His life, up until now, had been meticulously planned and executed, each move calculated to protect his empire and his reputation. His marriage to Adrienne had been a well-arranged partnership, one that served both of their ambitions. But with Kaylee, something was different. He hadn't expected her to be so open, so willing to step into the unknown with him. And yet she was, with a quiet strength that both fascinated and intimidated him. Kaylee, too, had been caught off guard by the shift in their dynamic. When she had agreed to this contract, it was a decision born of necessity, a way to provide for her family and escape the suffocating grip of debt. She had thought she could endure the cold formality of a marriage with a man she barely knew, seeing it as a means to an end. But over time, she had begun to see Isel as more than just a business partner. She saw the cracks in his armor, the parts of him that were still healing from past wounds. And somehow, she couldn't help but feel drawn to him. It was a strange feeling. This attraction, this pull toward a man who had made it clear that emotions and attachments were a luxury he couldn't afford. But the more time they spent together, the more she realized that he wasn't as invincible as he appeared. He was just as human as she was, carrying burdens and regrets that shaped the man he had become. And in that, she saw something worth understanding, worth exploring. One evening, a week after their conversation on the balcony, Isel invited Kaylee to attend a private charity gala with him. It was the type of event that required the perfect balance of charm, professionalism, and elegance, qualities Isel excelled at. But this time, as they prepared for the event in the penthouse, there was a palpable shift in the air. They weren't just two people fulfilling an obligation anymore. There was something else, something unspoken that lingered between them. Kaylee stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the emerald green dress that Isel had picked out for her. It was stunning, sleek and sophisticated, a perfect reflection of the life she had entered. But tonight, for the first time, she didn't feel like an actress in a role. She felt like herself, nervous, unsure, but real. She had stopped pretending. For better or worse, she was starting to see herself as more than just a placeholder in Isel's world. "Are you ready?" Isel's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, dressed in a dark tuxedo that only emphasized his commanding presence. He looked every bit the part of the CEO, strong, composed, untouchable. But there was something different about him tonight too. A flicker of something softer, something more vulnerable. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination, or if he too was feeling the shift in their relationship. "I think so," Kaylee said, offering a small smile. She had always prided herself on being able to play the part, to wear the mask when necessary. But tonight, it felt different. For once, she didn't have to be the perfect accessory to his life. She didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. Isel's eyes softened as he walked toward her, pausing just a few feet away. "You look beautiful, Kaylee," he said quietly, his voice sincere. The compliment caught her off guard. He had never been one to offer praise freely. And yet, there it was, simple, genuine, and unexpected. For a moment, she was speechless. She had never been this close to him without the weight of their roles pressing down on them, without the expectations of their public personas looming over them. But tonight, in the quiet of the penthouse, they were just two people. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was thanking him for the compliment or for the way he had allowed her to be herself in this moment. They made their way to the car in silence, the city lights flashing past as they drove toward the gala. The drive was smooth, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Neither of them knew exactly what to say. It felt like the first time they were truly seeing each other, not as a CEO and his contract wife, but as people. Two people who had been thrown together by circumstance, but who now found themselves in a place where they could no longer deny the connection between them. As they entered the gala, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. The ballroom was filled with the city's elite. Business tycoons, philanthropists, celebrities, all dressed in their finest, each one wearing a mask of perfection. Isel and Kaylee moved through the crowd like two pieces of a well-oiled machine, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands, and engaging in polite conversation. On the surface, it looked like any other event they had attended together. But underneath the polished exterior, something was different. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond that had begun to grow. Kaylee found herself glancing at Isel more than she expected. She had spent so many years focused on the business side of things, on the financial world, on surviving. But now, in the midst of the glittering gala, she couldn't help but wonder about the man beside her. He was surrounded by people who admired him, people who saw only the power and wealth that came with his name. But Kaylee saw something more. She saw the man who had been betrayed, who had lost trust in the people closest to him, and who had built an empire not out of love for the world, but out of a need to protect himself from it. Her thoughts were interrupted when Isel turned to her, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Would you like to step outside for a moment?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't just offering a break from the crowd. He was offering something more. Kaylee nodded, surprised by the invitation. They stepped out onto the terrace, where the cool night air was a welcome reprieve from the warmth of the ballroom. The city stretched out before them, the lights twinkling like stars below. It was a view she had grown accustomed to over the past few weeks, but tonight it felt different. It felt like they were finally seeing the world in a new way. Isel leaned against the railing, his posture relaxed, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his expression. "I never thought I would be standing here with someone who actually understands what this life is like," he said, his voice quiet, almost reflective. Kaylee glanced at him, her heart stirring at the sincerity in his words. "What do you mean?" "Everyone sees the success, the power," he said, his gaze fixed on the city below. "But they don't see the cost, the sacrifices, the loneliness. I've spent my whole life building something that I thought would give me meaning. But sometimes I wonder if it was all just an attempt to keep the emptiness at bay." Kaylee felt a pang of sympathy for him, a deep understanding of the struggles he had faced. She had spent so many years focused on her own survival, trying to keep her family afloat, that she hadn't allowed herself the luxury of questioning her choices. But now, standing here with Isel, she realized that they were both searching for something more, something beyond the contracts, beyond the roles they had been forced to play. "I understand more than you think," she said softly. "I've spent my whole life trying to survive, trying to do what's best for the people I love. But sometimes I forget what it feels like to truly live, to let go of the past and just be." There was a long pause as they stood together on the terrace, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. In that moment, the world seemed to fall away, and for the first time, they were not the CEO and the contract wife. They were simply two people, trying to navigate the messy, complicated reality of their lives. "I think we're both learning what it means to let go," Isel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Kaylee nodded, a quiet smile forming on her lips. "One step at a time, right?" Isel smiled back, the tension in his posture easing for the first time since they had met. "One step at a time," he agreed. And in that quiet, still moment, both of them realized that they had begun something neither of them had anticipated. A journey not defined by a contract or the expectations of others, but by the small, genuine steps they took toward understanding each other. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time, they were willing to find out where the path would lead. Together. A new beginning. The months that followed were marked by change, subtle, gradual shifts that neither Kaylee nor Isel could have predicted when they first entered this partnership. Their marriage, once a contract born out of necessity, slowly evolved into something neither of them expected. Isel, the CEO who had once built his life around control, began to allow himself moments of vulnerability. He still carried the weight of chosen industries, still held the reins of his empire, but now he also learned to share the burdens with someone he trusted, Kaylee. He had spent so long building walls around his heart, afraid of being hurt again, that he had forgotten what it was like to let someone in. But with Kaylee, it was different. She didn't ask for his power or his wealth. She didn't need him to be the perfect businessman. She just needed him to be human. Kaylee, too, found herself changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had come into this marriage with the goal of securing her family's future, but what she didn't expect was to find herself opening up to a man she had once thought of as a stranger. She had spent years focusing on surviving, on doing what needed to be done to get by. But through her connection with Isel, she rediscovered what it meant to live. She didn't have to sacrifice her own dreams or her own identity to support the people she loved. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of more. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when they both questioned if they were doing the right thing. They both carried scars. Kaylee from years of financial struggle, Isel from the betrayal of someone he had once trusted. But with each challenge they faced, they grew stronger together. They learned to communicate, to listen, and most importantly, to trust each other. One evening, after another successful business dinner, they found themselves alone on the balcony again, much like that first night when they had opened up to each other for the first time. The city stretched out before them, just as it had so many times before. But this time, the view didn't feel like a reminder of everything they had built. It felt like a symbol of everything they were still building together. Kaylee stood by the railing, her eyes tracing the horizon, feeling a deep sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. She had once thought that her life would always be defined by what she had to sacrifice. But now, she knew that life was defined by the choices they made, the willingness to take risks, to open up, and to let go of the past in order to embrace something better. Isel joined her, standing at her side in silence for a moment. His gaze rested on her, soft and contemplative. "You've changed me, you know that," he said quietly, his voice carrying a sincerity that made her heart swell. "I never thought I could trust anyone again, let alone let someone into my life like this. But with you, I don't feel like I'm holding on to the past anymore." Kaylee smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "I think we both know what it's like to carry the weight of the world. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore, Isel. Not with me." There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition that they had both stepped into something unknown, something neither of them could have planned or predicted. They had entered this contract marriage with separate motives, but somewhere along the way, they had found something far more valuable than security or stability. They had found each other. Isel took her hand, his grip steady, as though making a promise. "We've built something together, Kaylee. Something real. And I don't ever want to lose that." Kaylee turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a certainty she hadn't had before. "Neither do I. We don't need a contract to make this work. We just need each other." And in that moment, it became clear to both of them. The contract that had once defined their marriage no longer mattered. What mattered was the life they were creating together, the trust, the companionship, and the shared dreams that were slowly coming to fruition. They had started this journey as two people bound by circumstance, but now they stood side by side, not as strangers or business partners, but as equals, two people who had found their way to each other in spite of everything. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but that was the beauty of it. Life, after all, was never about perfection. It was about finding the courage to take the leap, to trust when it seemed impossible, and to build something worth having, step by step, together. As the night fell, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Isel and Kaylee stood together, looking toward the future, not as a contract, but as a promise that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. And that, in itself, was enough. The lesson: sometimes life throws us into situations that feel like they're beyond our control. We make decisions out of necessity, out of survival, and out of duty. But what we often forget is that, in the midst of those decisions, there lies the potential for growth, for change, and for connection. It's easy to hide behind walls of protection, to keep our hearts guarded, but true strength comes not from building those walls, but from allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. In the end, the most valuable thing we can build is not success or wealth, but real connections, connections based on trust, vulnerability, and shared experience. And when we learn to let go of the need for control and embrace the uncertainty of life, we find that the best things often come when we least expect them. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.